Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Subversive Studies podcast, where we explore the subversion of dominant societal norms, values, and ways of seeing the world in order to work to create new liberatory paradigms. I'm your host, Dan Glenn. Today, my guest is Dr. Vanessa Sinclair. Dr. Sinclair is a psychoanalyst in independent practice who sees patients internationally, specializing in online and remote treatment. A founding member of Das Unbehagen, a free association for psychoanalysis, Dr. Sinclair facilitates events and conferences internationally, including Civilization and its Bliss-contents on Violence and Psychoanalysis, which occurred in New York in 2015 with Manya Steinkoler, which has evolved into a forthcoming book from Routledge called On Psychoanalysis and Violence, Contemporary Lacanian Perspectives, and the Psychoanalysis, Art, and the Occult conference, which was in London in 2016, co-hosted with Carl Abrahamsson. Dr. Sinclair hosts Rendering Unconscious, a podcast in which she explores these topics. She is currently editing a collection of psychoanalytic writing and poetry under the same name. She co-authored a book of cutup poetry called Switching Mirrors, and her book Scansion in Psychoanalysis and Art, The Cut in Creation, is forthcoming from Routledge. Together with artist Katelan Foisy, she explores the creative potential inherent in the cutup method. A book on their work, Chaos of the Third Mind, is upcoming from Fulgur. So clearly, as you can see, this is someone with a tremendous amount of creative energy and a brilliant mind, and our conversation is an exploration of all of these interconnected topics: psychoanalysis, society, the unconscious, sexuality and its subversive power, identity, the cutup method, creativity and art, the occult, and more. I'm still buzzing from this conversation, which just occurred and which I enjoyed so much. My grandfather was a psychoanalyst, and I feel that the psychoanalytic perspective lives deep in my bones and blood and informs the way that I understand the world a great deal. So it was truly invigorating for me to talk with Vanessa about such a magical, mysterious, and fun intersection of topics. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or SoundCloud. Please share widely on social media with friends and family and colleagues, and give us a good rating on iTunes or Stitcher as well. I think you're going to enjoy this one a lot. I'm so glad you're all along for the journey. Thank you so much. Without further ado, my conversation with Vanessa Sinclair. Okay. Well, Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
The first thing I was curious to explore with you is just talking about psychoanalysis as a whole, and particularly at a time when evidence-based practices and cognitive behaviorist approaches to psychotherapy are quite dominant in the field. What do you see as the role of psychoanalysis, and why is it important today?
That's a great question. Definitely CBT and behavioral therapies, and of course medications, are kind of the go-to for the field as a whole in psychology, psychiatry. But I think that psychoanalysis is having a sort of comeback at this moment and a resurgence, because I think people in general are tired of being labeled as pathological. Everybody's depressed, everybody's anxious. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe there's not something biologically wrong with everybody in the country, if you're talking about America. I'm from America originally, even though I'm in Stockholm now. So I think that people are looking more towards exploring their minds, exploring their lives and not putting so many labels on themselves. Labels can be helpful in the understanding that there are other people, or enough other people have gone through what you're going through right now, that there's a name for it. And in that way, it can be really helpful and make people feel more part of a community, or more like they belong, instead of feeling really alienated or isolated when they are feeling depressed or anxious, or whatever other kinds of symptoms they may be experiencing. And CBT and behavior therapies are useful, especially if someone's in crisis. If somebody's having a panic attack, you need ways to address that in the moment that can calm them down. So doing relaxation exercises, and especially like doing them on a regular basis, even when you're not having panic attacks, can make it so that you don't have them as often. And that's just a very physiological mechanism that helps your autonomic nervous system kick in instead of your sympathetic nervous system, so that you go into relaxation mode instead of the fight or flight syndrome. And those can be very useful, and I'm totally fine with using those with patients and teaching them those skills, as in cognitive behavioral therapy, like teaching people how to look at what their thoughts are and say, like, whose thought is that? Where is that coming from? Can I question that thought? Instead of it being like something that's defining me, like, why do I think this about myself? Why am I being so hard on myself? So being able to like take space and separate yourself from your thoughts and kind of look at them in a way can be very useful, and can help people get out of these kind of spirals or cycles that people get stuck in. And those are great, but they're not the solution, in that they're only kind of techniques for managing when you're having symptoms, and maybe giving yourself a little space from your symptoms, but they don't get to the root of the problem of why you're having these symptoms in the first place. Why am I thinking this about myself? Why am I having an anxiety attack? Why am I hallucinating? So psychoanalysis can help get to the root of things. And originally, when people started prescribing psychiatric medication, the idea was supposed to be that this was to help control the symptoms so that people could do the work of psychoanalysis underneath. Like psychiatrists used to do psychoanalysis also, but now they're not trained in psychoanalysis unless they go specifically to be trained in psychoanalysis after they already have their MDs, and very few people decide to do that, because why would you, when you can see 10 people in an hour and give them meds and make that much money per patient, or you could see one person for an hour and listen to them talk. Most of them choose to just give people meds.
Yeah. Can we dig in a little further to the kind of interplay between society and the individual deep psychoanalytical work, in the sense that you started off by talking about the maybe this is something it's not just about the individual being pathological, and then, but at the same time, obviously, there is a depth of personal inner work that is going on. And yeah, I'm curious how those two balance, and kind of the acknowledgement of the incredibly difficult society we live in, and the ways that these systems in place are a huge part of what make people suffer. And at the same time, that there also is individual work that we can do on a personal level as well. So yeah, just curious how you see those two playing off one another.
Absolutely. I think that doing the work, the like insight-oriented work of psychoanalysis and looking at yourself can help you to parse out what's coming from the inside, what's coming from the childhood, what's coming from your parents, and that sort of thing, which really your family is like your first mini society, right? And then what's coming from the overarching society that you're in, and kind of help you make sense as to what is under your control more in the immediate moment, and what isn't. And if, I think giving people these tools gives people a greater sense of autonomy and a greater sense of being able to affect change, and to also know when it's something that they can't change right in that moment. I mean, we can through like protests or this sort of thing, but if you can't change something that you realize has been like imposed upon you right in the moment, to be able to give yourself some space from that and work on the things that you can change, so that you can be more effective in the place that you are in society, in the place you are in your life right then. And of course, to be able to feel the anger or whatever kinds of feelings come with that, but not to let that debilitate you. To be able to become more an active agent of change in your own life, and then if you choose, in the society at large as well. And that's one of the reasons why I try to get psychoanalysis, the ideas of psychoanalysis, out more to the general population. Like I did a lecture series at the Morbid Anatomy Museum in Brooklyn for a while. And, people that were coming in weren't familiar with psychoanalysis. They were interested in these occult ideas or morbid anatomy, these scientific, pseudoscientific ideas and that sort of thing. But as soon as you kind of get into these ideas with pretty much the general public, most everybody understands it because it reflects or feels resonant to their internal experience. So people can grasp onto the ideas pretty quickly, and see how they are at play in their own lives, but they're just not exposed to it really at all. I mean, I have a PsyD, which is a doctorate in psychology, and in my graduate school, we only read one paper by Freud, and I went out of my way to take all the analytic classes that they had as my electives, but still we were reading people that were post-Freud and object relations and ego psychologists, and it was very limited to what those two professors were interested in. But if they didn't choose to take those as my electives, I wouldn't have read any psychoanalytic theory at all in a graduate psychology program. So I feel like that's a real shame, because even if people choose to work in a hospital system or somewhere where they don't feel to be as useful, I feel like it's been such a huge part of the field of psychology in general that at least people should have to learn it historically, at least read it a little bit or understand it to be able to work in the field of psychology, but they just don't anymore.
Yeah, that's it's a really interesting aspect of the way that things have unfolded in the field, or increasingly it seems.
But I think it's exactly because of this idea of subversion, because psychoanalysis is subversive, and you do get people to think. And the more people are thinking about their experience, and the more they feel in control of their experience, or that they have tools to change their experience, the less easy they are to control. And unfortunately, CBT and medications help people put their symptoms at bay so that they can go to work, so that they can have a family, so that they can do all the things that Americans are supposed to do, without feeling too much suffering. And that might be nice for some people, but for some people it might be causing a bigger disconnect, because they're kind of numbing themselves, and they're not able to really feel what they're feeling and know what they need to know about their own lives and their place in the world.
Right. The systemic, what's imposed systemically might be much less tolerable, to the point that they would want to actually or need to change something, rather than constantly trying to subdue or just get by, or that sense of things. And I mean, I feel like it's such an interesting thing too. Like, so there's that side of it where it makes people sort of, the less self-aware and kind of consciously awake people are, the easier they are to kind of just live a conventional life. And not that there's anything wrong with the conventional life, but kind of maybe not recognizing the potential of their humanity, and also recognizing the structures in place that are harmful, because they're just been so normalized, right? And then also, I mean, it strikes me too that so much of the obsession with power and domination and control that comes from the people who are putting those systems in or maintaining those systems, um, come from a projection of internal psychological factors, I guess is how I understand it. And this is why I feel like for me that intersection between the sort of socio-political world and the psycho-spiritual world it's so intertwined. And I think it seems like a lot of people have one perspective or another. And I think increasingly people are recognizing that both are completely intertwined and vitally important. But you definitely see a lot of people who are very like maybe revolution oriented that really focus on the systemic aspects. But I think that ultimately is limited without a deep psycho-spiritual awareness. And then, people who kind of are only interested in doing psychological or spiritual work, but don't sort of recognize what's happening systemically or how those are interconnected.
Yeah, and how it limits them. We don't live on an island, each one of us. We all live together.
Yeah.
And I think that for the individual, we always, even if we feel helpless with what's going on in society, you can always make kind of your world around you a little bit better or a little bit more the way you want by treating people the way that you think people should be treated and that sort of thing. And I feel like most people are relatively, have relatively good values with how they treat one another. But unfortunately, there's like a segment of society that's antisocial, like these businessmen that just say, oh, well, it's business, so we can, screw you over or take all your money or take your house because it's better for business. Like this kind of way of treating people is, unfortunately, I feel like it's a very small segment of society, but they wield a lot of power. And I think you're right that it has to do with their own internal issues. And like people that, persecute people that in the LGBT community, for example, like I absolutely think the persecutors of that have their own kind of difficulties with their own sexuality, and they're projecting and acting out all over the place, because otherwise why would you go to such lengths to hurt people, to persecute them, and try to lock them up or keep them from being able to use the restroom they feel comfortable in? Like, what is wrong with you?
Right.
Why would you do that?
Yeah.
Anybody who's comfortable with themselves or done work on themselves or insight wouldn't act that way towards other people.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just, I feel the same, have the same thoughts. It's just like, it doesn't make any sense why anyone would kind of have that orientation. If they had even a modicum of like kind of self comfort with themselves, really, or some like degree of centeredness or something, so yeah, it's really, it seems like it's almost like this you could see the world, the all the horrors of the world is like in some way this like projection, like projectile vomit of all these people who are actually deeply suffering themselves, but just can't even relate to it on that level.
Mm-hmm. And I was even saying to my husband today, because we were just like walking around Stockholm admiring the architecture and like talking about how ingenious people are, that they learn how to build these things. But humans are like, have such ingenuity and capacity in so many areas, but emotionally as a whole, we're like infants. And that's another reason why I think we really need more psychoanalytic thinking or insight oriented thinking, because people need to stop acting out, their internal transferences towards their parents and why they're mad at their sister or why they're mad at their mother on everyone around them. Because we have to all live together, and there's so many people in the world at this point, and it's just going to grow, that we can't keep acting out this way. It's not going to work.
Yeah,
it's not working.
It's definitely not working.
Maybe it worked better when there were little tribes of people all over the planet, and people fought their neighbors and then took their land. But it doesn't work now. You can't do that. Everybody has their own land. All the land is occupied. Leave everybody with their land and leave them alone. Let them live their lives.
Yeah. So one of the papers that you shared with me that I read to consider some topics for our conversation is called Polymorphous Perversity and Pandrogyny. And in it, one of the key kind of ideas is this. I'll share just a couple of sentences here that you said. In psychoanalysis, sexuality and the unconscious are one and the same. Sexuality is intrinsically subversive. And then later, going on to say sexuality is the key to subverting control. So there might be people that really intuitively kind of grasp what you're saying there. But I think it's so fascinating, and there's a lot of layers here. So I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little, and we could just explore how that link works between sexuality and the unconscious, and then in turn, what we've been talking about, sort of subverting control.
Sure. There's a few points to make with that. So the artists that the paper is about are this couple, Lady J and Genesis Breyer-Pureridge. And when Genesis, before he met Lady J, there's a video interview with Jen in the 1980s sometime when Psychic TV, Jen has this band called Psychic TV, but it started out as more of a, less of a band and more of this video group where they would do cut-up film and then make music to accompany the film rather than like music videos accompanying music. And this is like around 1982 when MTV was just starting and that sort of thing. So they were kind of subverting it in that moment. And Jen said in this interview that I thought was really great that he noticed that in every society, there's always these rules. The government always has these rules against sexuality, how to control sexuality, what people's sexuality should be, what's okay and what's not okay. And a lot of times they're written into the laws. And he thought, if there was something in every society that was always trying to control these sexual taboos and decide what was okay and what wasn't, that there must be something important going on there. Why is every government, every civilization trying to control people's sexuality? So he thought that he should explore that. And I thought that was pretty brilliant because it's true. And I think that a lot of the problems that we do see that we've been talking about are because people have so many outside forces categorizing their sexuality, their identity, what's okay, what's not okay, how are you able to identify, who are you able to identify with, who are you able to have sex with, why, which positions. I mean, there's so many of these ideas, and I think that if you would just realize that adults should be able to do whatever they would like with whoever they would like, it's also an adult who's consenting, then that should be it. And that's the end of it. Let people do what they want. Let them explore what they want. Let them find what's erotic in what they like. They don't have to do things they don't like. And just because you don't like something or you don't want to do something doesn't mean that you can't keep other people from doing it. So then if you don't like something or you don't want to do something, then don't do it. It's as simple as that. But they always try to control everybody else. I don't understand this. I find this repulsive, so now none of you can do it either. And it's really infantile, quite frankly. So that's one point. And as far as the unconscious being sexuality, the idea with that, it's a Freudian, Lacanian, Laplanchian idea. Those are the analysts that I tend to read the most. But the idea is that the unconscious is originally formed through primal repression. So like we're born, I'm not sure if we're born without an unconscious or not. But the idea there is that we're born likely without an unconscious. they say. We'll say Laplanche says. And then the unconscious comes into being once we have our first repression, and then we have the separation between what's conscious and what's unconscious. And usually the first repression is something that's overwhelming, overstimulating, which is sexual, not necessarily being like your mother or the adult that's taking care of you is doing something sexual at you, but your mother or the adult that's taking care of you has their own sexuality. And that's there already because they're an adult. So they've already gone through this repression and have an unconscious and impulses and fantasies that some they're aware of and some they're not, and that sort of thing. And the adults are going to kind of have these fantasies in play around you as the infant, whether you like it or not, basically. Whether it's the mother and the father or the people that are raising you or your siblings or whoever else is around, everyone's sexual. Everybody has their own unconscious fantasies are at play that you don't understand because you're brand new. And you don't really have any way of structuring this or understanding it or being able to process the impulses that are coming at you and the impulses that you might have coming back out in response to them. So at some point, really early on, we're talking about, very, very small infant. At some point really early on, you have a bit of overwhelming stimulation and you repress it because you can't deal with it right now. I don't have time for that yet. I don't have an ego yet. I can't really process this. And then once one thing is repressed, things just keep getting repressed. So things that are repressed are usually things that are making you uncomfortable and that you can't really deal with. So sometimes those things are sexual. Sometimes those things end up being violent acts. Anybody who's had like something really violent happen to them, some sort of trauma, has had the experience where, months, years later, you start remembering something that you had repressed a long time ago. So if something's too overwhelming for your ego or your conscious mind to be able to process at the time, it gets repressed, but the repressed always wants to be known. So it doesn't stay repressed. It ends up coming back at some point, even if it's just in small ways. In small pieces that you can handle bit by bit until you piece together a bigger picture. But some analysts would argue that even things that are overstimulating in a violent way could still be considered something sexual because it's still overwhelming, exciting, overstimulating.
It's interesting that I think a lot of so based on what we were talking about before, right? You can kind of see how these internalized can't deal with experiences get kind of buried away, stuck, but are still informing everything we do or much of what we do, and then in turn get kind of played out in all kinds of spheres of our life. And so it seems like the more that someone can bring those to the surface. I mean, would you say it's can what is unconscious be brought to consciousness, or is it is that not the way you would frame it?
Well, absolutely. That's why psychoanalysis works the way it does,
Mm-hmm.
and why traditionally people would meet with their analyst multiple times a week, because you are doing this in-depth work and you are making conscious these things that have been repressed for so long, and they're repressed for a reason. They're not comfortable. Right. So you're bringing them up. So that's why it's good to meet with somebody multiple times a week, because that way you can dig it up and not be left for a week with this thing that you just realized and have to sit there with it, because that could be overwhelming again, or could just impede the progress of the analysis, because if it's still too overwhelming, then maybe it won't come up at all. But if your mind kind of knows you'll be back in this office tomorrow or in 2 days, then it's okay, I'll be able to sit with it outside of here for a day. So let it come up now, because it's all you, so it's basically you letting yourself know or giving yourself hints that there's things inside you need to deal with. And what we were talking about at the beginning with like anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms, symptoms don't happen for no reason. There's nothing inherently wrong with people. You know, people, if you're having a symptom, if you're having anxiety, depression, hallucinations, bipolar, or whatever, there's a reason for it. And like anxiety attacks, for example, it's like something overwhelming bursting through from your unconscious to your consciousness, and it can just make you into a panic or make you completely frozen or paralyzed or make you think you're going to die because it's too much to handle. But that just speaks to the severity of what you need to deal with, because there's something that you've been pushing down for so long that your mind is telling you it's time for us to deal with this. We can't keep this down here anymore. And you can also think of it as like energetically, it takes a lot of your energy to keep all these things pushed down and at bay. And so when you do start doing the work of making these things conscious and what they call working through them, working through processing them, Laplanche calls it metabolizing. You have to metabolize all of your experiences. It frees up your energy because you don't have so much energy spent psychically keeping these things down all the time. And then you'll find you have more energy to do what you want, go create something, go on trips or whatever that you've been wanting to do that you haven't been able to do. You'll start having the energy to do it finally. And that's really important, and that can be really motivating to keep doing the work. You'll start writing more, you'll start painting, you'll start being more social, you know, whatever it is that you've been wanting to do that you've been held back from.
Yeah. And so it also seems like there are perhaps other ways to work with the unconscious in addition to, or as well as on the couch, so to speak, or, you know, in the therapeutic setting, where and one of the things you talk about in this paper, and you actually tie in with this gender, sexuality, and identity aspect, is the cutup method of William S. Burroughs and Brian, is it Geisen pronounced? Yeah. And I know this is a very significant practice for you. You've shared a lot of your art and creative endeavors that utilize this particular approach, and I'm curious to hear a bit about why it's significant for you, and also how it ties in with the unconscious and also with identity in this psychoanalytic sense.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, both psychoanalysis and the cutup method have totally changed my life at various points. And so I love them both. I think creativity in general is key. And I think every single human creates in some way, whether they consider themselves an artist or not. You know, whether you're painting, drawing, writing, building something, cooking, having a garden, these are all like creative acts. And I think people's lives in general, like before sort of this capitalist system where we're just earning money for these corporations, you know, if you looked at people's day-to-day lives before, yes, it was more difficult in that you had to cook and you know, preserve the food for the winter and this sort of thing as a survival strategy, but also like the day-to-day life that people were living was more creating their life the way they wanted it to be or needed it to be all the time. Like that's all we were doing. And even if you look at like I was talking about today, walking through Stockholm, looking at these buildings, I mean, people have built all these things. All of this is all created. Our entire society and civilizations are created by people's ideas and hands, you know. So I think everybody is creative in some way. And so doing whatever it is that you're driven to do in that way is important. Everybody has something, knitting, whatever it is. But the cutup method in particular, I can't even remember how I got into it in the first place. I mean, I knew about William Burroughs, you know, forever, since high school or whatever. But I guess it really started being something that I did on a daily basis when I met my, what we call third mind partner, Katelan Foisy. She lives in Chicago and is an artist there. And I guess when we became friends, we both realized that we were really into the cut up technique. I used to do it like once in a while, cut up an article in the paper or something like that and just rearrange it for fun. But it wasn't really something I did all the time. I more read Burroughs' work and was familiar with Geison's work and their work together. For those that aren't familiar, Geison was a visual artist, and he rediscovered this cut up technique when he was laying down pieces of newspaper to paint on a canvas on top of. And then he took a straight razor and was cutting the canvas. And he cut the newspaper underneath the canvas. And then when he moved the canvas, say some of the paper moved away that he had cut, and it was the lines of the newspaper were reading from one page to a different page one was on top of the other. And then when he kind of looked at that, he noticed that it made this sort of sense, even though it was like at random. So then him and Burroughs started doing that together, and then they just had a lot of fun with it. And Burroughs used it for the rest of his career, and made some of his books are entirely made of cut-ups. Like some of his books are not only cut-ups that he did with his own work, but like he'd take his favorite authors and just cut out paragraphs from different authors that he loved, and then he just paste them all together, and then it would become a book. So some people don't realize that, but there's a lot of, I guess, magic in it. It's something subversive in that it gets you out of your kind of conscious, rational way of thinking, and just lets things kind of play out in a more uncanny, randomized, chance sort of way that, like Geison realized, can make a lot of sense at times, or makes you see things or think of things in a way that you might not have thought of them on your own. So when I met Katelan, this was 5 years ago or so, I started doing cut-ups with her, and then I started doing cut-ups every day with my writing and I'm friends with Genesis. I cut up Genesis's writing, Carl's writing, my husband, different people that use the cut-up method themselves. So I think that kind of gives the work I've been doing kind of an extra potency, because most of the artists or authors that I cut up are people that cut up. So it's kind of like exponentially cut up, basically. And for a long time, I did it every single morning. Like, I wake up and write down my dreams. I dream very vividly, so I remember them pretty much every night. And then I would do a cut up. I had like a box of cut up material that I just would cut different things up and throw them in this box and shake it up and pull out a few and make these poems. And then I'd see how a lot of the times the cut-ups themselves would be reflective of the dreams that I had. And that was always super interesting.
And, I forget if it was in the article or maybe it was in an interview I listened to that you did, but you were talking about how it's not only, the cut-up method is not necessarily just limited to, say, cutting up words and mixing them up and putting them back together in some way. It could be considered in a broader sense of snippets of a headline or images. And I started realizing that I'm really into this kind of thing. And I think I don't think I've ever consciously engaged in the cut up method in the sort of classical sense, perhaps, but I'm realizing that, like, lately especially, I'm really into like taking pictures of a little snippet of a book I'm reading, say, and kind of like share and then sharing it on Instagram or wherever, and it's like this. There's something about, or like the comics out of context, like those one panel, you get like a glimpse of a comic or graphic novel panel where you're only getting one kind of out of context slice of something,
Mm-hmm.
but yet for whatever reason it kind of pops, like it offers this kind of hit of what to me I would call like wakefulness, or maybe it's like a gap between the conscious and the unconscious mind. It kind of wakes you up in some way, and so, and even just, I don't know if photography it would be considered a facet, one example of the cutup method in a certain sense, but
Yeah,
sometimes
it's just a slice right there. You just cut
exactly,
it out.
yeah.
Mhm.
So it's funny because reading your work and listening to the other podcast interview with Leo that you did, and it was just like I started thinking about the cutup method and thinking that, oh wow, like I kind of do this, and I'm like increasingly really into it these days, and so it's an interesting little synchronicity here that here we are discussing it too.
No, absolutely. And when you get really into it, like when I was doing them every morning and then other times throughout the day, and then reading Burroughs, and then like listening to Throbbing Gristle, Genesis's old bands, like all the music they made was cut up, and you like go into these cut up mind frames. And you can see it everywhere, actually. And even like Katelan and I, when we give our talks sometimes about cut ups, even every time you have a memory that can be considered like a cut through time. Like if I have a memory about something that happened to me on some day now every time I retrieve that memory in the future, this time that I retrieved it is now attached to it. So that there's like all these different slices of time that become this kind of string of memory or your life that's in a different way than it was originally. Or like Burroughs would say, if you want to just cut up your life day to day, he would say to take these color walks. So if you have like a very routine day where you like take the same train to the same stop and get off and walk the same amount of blocks to work every day or something like that, if you want to kind of change it up a little, pick a different color each day to focus on. Like pick red, and now you're doing a color work with red, and notice all the different red things that are around you, or all the different blue things or green things. So even though you're taking the same walk every day, you're now noticing different aspects of the things that you're walking by. And he writes about like seeing headlines in the paper that then are reflective of some cut up that he made years ago or some sort of thing, and he would keep scrapbooks of them so that he could show these like links in time from like things that happened in society and things that were happening in his own kind of personal world, or like things that he'd be writing while he was on a train, and then you look out the window and see this sort of synchronicity between something that was going on outside of the train and something that he had been writing at that moment. And he would keep notebooks full of these kinds of synchronicities and things.
That's so cool. Yeah, it seems like that's like the occult aspect too. Is like you're somehow, maybe it feels like you're tapping into some larger mystery, or kind of like, I think by like restructuring linearity and like you said, time, you're kind of, rather than just pursuing the kind of linear rational mind, you're kind of allowing the unconscious, you're allowing the non-linear to emerge, and hidden things can arise out of that.
Yeah, because that's more reflective too of how humans are in the world. Like we do learn in these sort of spirals or circuits, and that's why this idea, like say with CBT or something we were talking about earlier, so like you need to change your behavior in this like very causal direct way, can be problematic, because sometimes people feel like, oh, if I make the same slip that I've been making, that I've been trying to work towards not making again, now I failed because I slipped up. Like AA is a perfect example. It can help a lot of people with its social structure and that sort of thing, but sometimes it makes people feel more stuck, because like, oh, if I had a drink even though I didn't have a drink for 180 days, now I have to start up again at zero,
Right.
And like that's not realistic. Like of course it's still progress even if you slipped up, if you didn't slip up for 180 days. So you should just more see that as like sometimes people slip into their old patterns when they're especially stressed or something like that, and just like pick yourself up and start, you know, feeling good the next day, but not feeling so guilty that you like ruined everything, because you didn't ruin everything. You still had this huge amount of time where you did feel like you were on the right track, you know, and that you shouldn't have that taken away from you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that example maybe speaks somewhat to the identity aspect of this. I don't remember how much that thread has come through in our, as we've been talking, but it just strikes me that it feels like when, and particularly today, when identities, you know, which certainly have value and are helpful in terms of understanding people's positionality, but when they also become very solidified and kind of entrenched, the sense of seeing oneself and also kind of presenting oneself in the world as this solid identity or this solid type of person or whatnot, there's a box that's kind of getting increasingly placed around one, and something about these ways of kind of cutting up your life or kind of working in your life by I don't know, dissecting is the right word, but kind of disrupting linearity or disrupting that solidity. It just feels like it allows for a lot more possibility to emerge.
Exactly. And that's the book that I'm working on with Routledge that's due in May, that's talking about the cutup method and these different kinds of artists that use it. It's called Scansion in Psychoanalysis and Art. And Scansion is actually like linguistic technique that Jacques Lacan uses a lot in psychoanalysis. And it's this idea of the cut, of disrupting the session, and kind of disrupting people's narratives, but disrupting it in a way that then helps something new grow. So it's not like trying to take people's narratives away from them, but you know, if you work with patients and say you have like a 45-minute or an hour session, you notice when people get really kind of good at analysis or therapy, that they, you know, have an internal awareness of what time you're at in the session. So a lot of times you'll see people come in and kind of talk about their day, takes a little time to open up, and then they get to these kind of more meaty moments or in-depth moments in the middle, and then they kind of get to the end of the session and kind of tie everything back up with a little bow so that they can feel okay going out of the room. And that's okay, you know, for people to do that, but also it does them a little bit of a disservice because you kind of put back the constructs that you came in with in order to go back into the world. So Lacan's idea was that if you sort of stop the session when people are having those more deep, meaty moments of like realization and kind of aha, you know, if they're in analysis and they're coming back the next day, maybe it's okay to leave them a little bit more open and vulnerable when they leave, so that they, instead of putting everything back together where it was, you know, maybe not all the way, but a little bit more, maybe if you leave people more open, then they'll just think more in that space that they were in when they were really kind of opened up and bringing a lot of unconscious material up. So that was his idea. He would actually stop the sessions at those moments. I don't really do that, and I don't really stop people's sessions early, but I found that there's definitely ways to kind of mark those moments without necessarily like kicking someone out of the room. I think that's more like Lacan's personality, you know, like, I'm just going to throw you out and you're just going to have to go into the world with this right now and wonder why I chose that moment. But my personality, I can't really do that to people. So I'll just, I try to not overinterpret what people are saying, but I just try to use their language and say it back to them. So if someone seems like they're this very like kind of vulnerable moment, I'll just kind of repeat what they said like back to them so that they hear it. And they also know, like, since I don't talk a whole lot, if I'm saying something, maybe that's something that seemed like it stood out a bit that they should look at, or that sort of thing. But also in like asking, another way to do it is just to ask people like where that idea came from, because in symptoms, in depression. People have these narratives about themselves, and they say them like they're so like solid, like I am like this, I always do this, and they're really like kind of married to these ideas about themselves. So even if you just question like where do you think that came from, or whose voice is that, or where do you think you developed that idea, just so that they even look like maybe they're not like that. Like I procrastinate, is a huge one. I always do things at the last minute. Why are you so down on yourself? Or maybe you do things at the last minute because you'll get them done without having to spend weeks on it. Like maybe that works for you and it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Maybe it's efficient even. So I feel like I've also recently realized that my view of humans is maybe very skewed, because I always see people that are coming in for treatment. So they're people that want to look at themselves and want to do the insight-oriented work. But for the people that want to do insight-oriented work, most of these things that they think are problematic about themselves are things that they've developed that really were adaptive at some point in their life, and maybe they're not working for them so much anymore, and they've become maladaptive, or they're not like working as well as kind of coping mechanisms as they used to. But people aren't inherently problematic. People generally are pretty ingenious and adaptive and figure out how to work in the world. So if there's a way that's not working for you, it's probably because it did work for you at some point, maybe when you lived with your parents, but now you don't live with those people anymore, and maybe you don't need to interact with everyone the way you interacted with them, because maybe it doesn't work best for you now.
Right.
And as far as identity, that's one of the things that Genesis and Lady J really show in their work, the Pandrogyny Project, is that, if you want an identity that's very solid and like one way, you can build that for yourself or identify that way. But, a lot of people change throughout their lifetime, or their sexuality might change, or maybe based on a certain individual that they meet, they find themselves attracted to someone that they've never been attracted to before. And that's okay. And I think just leaving room for like all the different variations and all the different ways that sexuality might play out, or all the different ways people might present in the world, is important, because people are put in these boxes. This is how you have to be. Or like for me, for example, as someone who's like dated all sorts of different people, when I dated a trans woman, I was treated differently than when I dated a cis woman, and I was treated differently than when I am with my husband, who's a cis man. Like every time I've been in one of these relationships, I've been treated very differently based on who I'm dating. But all the time, it's me,
Right.
But people completely judge you and have completely different ideas about you based on who you're sleeping with. Yeah. And I find that really odd, honestly.
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
I think it speaks to like, I don't know, one thread that's been running through my mind as you've been talking is this notion of like allowing people to stay in their comfort zones versus not. And this sense of like the Lacan thing of, maybe, and you could just kind of let someone have a kind of gentle psychotherapeutic experience, and maybe that's what someone needs sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I often finding that balance, I think, between nurturing and caring, and then also disrupting and kind of breaking through someone's habitual mind, or finding ways. And that doesn't, I think the mistake that people often make when you try to, people, I think it's really, I found it really helpful that you said, well, that's Lacan's personality, but that's not me, and I think, there's like crazy wisdom teachers in this world that a lot of people have tried to kind of imitate, rather than take on. I'm thinking of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in particular. I've been involved in his teachings and community for a time, and seeing people like kind of trying to be like him versus really internalizing their own awakeness, right, or their own ability to kind of become who they are and live in a conscious way, and then naturally knowing how and when to work with people and how to kind of maneuver through situations and what people need and how you can help people wake up and how you can help people, feel nurtured when they need that. And so it just, I've been thinking about this kind of dynamic of like, when do you choose to kind of make that cut? When do you choose to kind of disrupt someone's comfortable narrative and like pierce a little hole in their cocoon world and let some fresh air? But that's often very uncomfortable for people too. And I mean, it seemed like that happens in social settings when, if something about what someone is seeing with you and a partner is making them uncomfortable, or it disrupts their understanding of how the conventional world would work or something like that. And it's interesting because I think I often feel a tendency to really want things to be smooth, like everyone to be okay and feel, comfortable and safe, and no one to kind of have any kind of uncomfortable disruption challenge. But then there's also the side of me that really wants that and recognizes the importance of, how do we kind of help break each other out of these routinized ways of seeing the world that are ultimately harmful.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I think that as far as like within analysis, it's really individual to individual based on the analyst or the therapist. And I think that that's one of the things that's a shame in the fields of psychology and psychoanalysis, is that people are trained in one way and then they treat all the patients that way. Like, I only do CBT, or I only do Lacanian psychoanalysis, or I only do this or that, or I only give medication. And I think it's really helpful that I've been trained in so many different ways, and that I did end up in a graduate school. Like, it didn't even occur to me when I went to graduate school that CBT and psychoanalysis were so disparate and didn't talk to each other. Like, I didn't even think of that, because to me, like, of course, these are all different aspects of humans and how they interact in the world. And of course, they're all useful in their own way. So I didn't even know what I was getting into when I picked this school that I went to. And then I didn't realize it was going to be so CBT oriented. But I think because of that, I ended up working in the hospital system for a very long time. And so I know what the medical system is like from working inside it. And I think ultimately that's really helped me have a perspective on our society, because it's very messed up. And the medical system is very messed up. And I've worked in city hospitals, county hospitals, when there are Medicare cuts and Medicaid cuts, and seeing like how the patients are treated and how they're given only certain medications and not others because they're no longer covered when those medications don't work for them. I worked in an HIV clinic for a long time, and like they would just only be able to give certain HIV medications to patients. But if anybody knows anything about HIV, there's a lot of tests people have to undergo to figure out the kinds of strains of HIV they have, and then a lot of tests to figure out which medications work for those strains. And it's a very specific combination of medications that end up suppressing the virus and keep it from replicating. And you can't just change that just because the insurance doesn't want to pay for it anymore. So I saw a lot of people get really sick because of things like that. So I think that was very useful for me in my own, even just personal development. And I didn't really understand that kind of systemic violence and that kind of systemic issue that America has and is facing. And that's why, even though I like can't wait for the day that this government changes, there's so many layers of issues to be addressed. It's pretty overwhelming, to be honest. And the way the incarceration system is linked to the education system and is linked to the medical system, and they're basically all the same companies that own all of this, and they keep people sick and they keep not paying for things for a reason, because they're making money off of everybody. So there's a lot of things to take down. But I think individually, like in the fields of psychology and psychoanalysis, what people can do, at least for me, like I tend to be a very like warm person, make people very comfortable kind of naturally. Probably why I became a therapist, because I'm like pretty good at doing that. So I think my patients know that if I'm pointing something out or like being a little challenging, I'm doing it in like a caring way, like, hey, let's look at this. So they don't get so defensive. It's like, trying to like say, hey, don't poke me there. If I'm like pointing something out, it's probably because it's something that they could work through or something that's not serving them. And they know that, and that's why they're coming in, and that's why they're continuing with me, because they know I'll help them feel better by challenging them a little bit to kind of get out of their shell, and work within the world in a new way that will serve them better. And most of my patients that I have now, since I did move from New York to Sweden recently, they're all people that I've still been seeing in private practice from New York, and some of them have moved to California, and some of them live in Oregon, different places in the country, and some of them live here in Europe. And most of them I've been seeing for many years now, and some of them have been through an analysis like multiple times a week, and some of them come once a week, some of them twice a week, some of them I've been seeing for longer, might only talk to me every other week now or once a month, just to kind of check in. So I think the therapist being flexible person needs at the time is also really important. Like many analysts would say, you can't have an analysis unless it's 4 times a week. But like I've definitely done analysis with people twice a week, for example, or for a period of 2 or 3 times a week for a period. And then once they kind of have that internal dialogue and analytic process going, then they can come less often because they're doing the work on their own, or they start journaling. Or the thing with analysis is once you start kind of processing things that way, or looking at the world and the different patterns that you're in, you just kind of start doing it all the time. And you notice like, oh, I'm acting this way with my friend and my partner, and this is how I was with my mom. And you just continue to see it, and you continue to work through it, so that you're not continually acting out these childhood patterns all the time that are just kind of keeping you stuck.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of also just that, walking through the world at like seeing things as an artist, or seeing, like sort of if once you start doing cut-ups, like everything starts to appear that way in a certain way. That's kind of like odd, almost surreal juxtaposition of visual and auditory experiences in the world. And so it's like when your mind starts to shift into a certain mode of perception, then it becomes just regular, ordinary. So maybe that's a little bridge to the Dada movement, which you also shared a paper with me on, that I also really loved. And I think maybe we don't have time to go into a whole lot of depth with it, but I feel like it's worth at least exploring briefly, and then maybe people can look into this themselves, and can talk more about the further work you have coming out on it. But that movement as one which was really trying to question and subvert society's accepted values and consensus worldview, as you wrote, and how that fits into what we've been exploring so far.
Sure. Well, as far as the cut-up method goes, Tristan Tzara, who was one of the people integral in the Dada movement in the beginning, he's the one who kind of invented the cut-up poem. He called them accidental poems. And he did it by cutting out a sentence and just putting all the words in a hat and then pulling them out randomly in a different order. So very simple, but still very effective. And they say like when he first did this, a riot broke out. Everyone was like, "What are you doing?" And it sounds funny, but even I've given lectures at colleges, and I sometimes like guest teach at different art schools and that sort of thing. And in one of the classes, that I was teaching in, I was showing this method to people, and I had them bring in just any sort of writing that was important to them, whether it was their own writing or, you know, a poet that they loved or an author that they loved. And I actually had two students, one student in particular, who cut up the paper and then like could not do it. She was like, I cannot do this. I hate this. This is not right. You're not supposed to do this. And she had to like piece it all back together the way it was, because she just couldn't like stand it. So I think it's true. Some people can't stand it, and that's fine. They don't have to like it. But some people do not want to be disrupted, or want people they love to be disrupted. And that is fine too. But I think the thing about the Dada movement and why I'm thinking about it now is because, you know, the period before the First World War, when they had all these different, you know, we had the Industrial Revolution, and war was completely different for the first time, where it was on a much more massive scale, and it was not as intimate. It wasn't people in hand-to-hand combat so much anymore. It was more machines. And so it was kind of giving people a distance, but also people would end up being maimed in a different way, and people were coming back a lot more with like really serious injuries, but also the medicine was better, so they were living through things that they might not have lived through before. So it was kind of changing the landscape of psychology, how people were thinking about war, how people were experiencing this kind of bodily trauma. And they were having a lot of more psychological trauma. That's the first war that they've said that, like shell shock and these kind of psychological traumas and injuries that were really recognized by the government instead of just being written off. So things were changing a lot then. And of course, now things are very different in that we have this like technological revolution with the internet and with drones and with things being on a global scale, and we're all infected much more differently, and we're more interconnected than we ever have been, and we're seeing what's happening more places than we ever have before. So I feel like we're in this kind of next shift, and it's 100 years later, and that's why the conference that I told you about, my next conference that I'm doing in May, is kind of about, it's called Rewriting the Future, Esoteric 100 Years of Esoteric Modernism and Psychoanalysis, but it's kind of a jumping off point from this same time period, like 100 years ago, the period before the First World War. What was going on then? What artists were doing with it? And how people were responding to it. And like the Dadas actually, you know, started painting, drawing, collaging, veterans coming back from the wars, and actually like at some point had this like idea of like this like half mechanical race of men that would take over the earth. And that's kind of what we're seeing again now with like AI and like humans breeding with technology and bridging this kind of divide, and what's going to happen and what's civilization going to look like. So I feel we're at this kind of kinship moment with that period in time, and psychoanalysis was just taking off at that time. That's what made me start writing about it in the first place. Is I was just a weird like confluence of events. I was like asked to like write a foreword for my friends, this artist Del Soto. He does these kind of random poems where he just writes these random poems and then like throws them and they disappear, like throw them into the audience or leave them on subway trains, or he just calls them throwaway poems. And he had written a piece for Abraxas, which was this magazine published by Fulgur out of Britain, and he had written a piece on Dada for them, and had asked me to write kind of a foreword or preface to his piece. So I was writing about Dada for Adele, and then I was also writing a book review on this book called the first 100 years of psychoanalysis. It was like the history of the International Psychoanalytic Association. So it was just like happening to do these two things at the same time. And then I realized like, oh, this was all happening at the exact same time, like in the exact same cities in Europe. So like what was going on during that time? And I started like exploring it and writing about it more and more. And there's going to be a lot about that in the book that I'm writing now too for Routledge.
Yeah, it sounds great, and it's interesting too, because I feel like I don't know a ton about the Dada movement, but I know there's a bridge with the situationists too, and connection there, and they're, I think of the situationists as very much both kind of psycho-spiritual political disruptors, and it seems like the Dada movement had that same kind of quality, and it's really interesting. And these approaches to creativity and that bridge, it's like being in the world in a creative way that disrupts the mind and thus causes
Change.
or yeah, influences social change. It's really amazing. And it's like to me that's like what we need, and it's the most interesting kind of way to be, because it combines kind of all these elements that are, like we've been discussing this whole time, are totally essential and intertwined.
Yeah, and they absolutely all play out, in my life. Like I cut up Freud and Jung and Lacan, and then I put them in with all these artists, and then I make poetry books out of them, or I collage them onto like pictures that I cut out of myself, magazines, and like make them into art, and then I read them out loud, and my husband makes music for them, and then I make a video to go along with the songs, and it all kind of feeds itself. And I find it really enjoyable, and it's definitely changed my life for the better. And when I went to school to become a psychologist, I mean, it's like 15 years of college, I never thought that I'd be like having art exhibitions in Sweden and Zurich, but like, great, here we are.
Yeah.
So that's another thing with identity, right? Like, some people that want to talk about the cutup method and that sort of thing, or esoteric stuff, think of me as an artist. Like this last conference that I spoke at here in Stockholm in April, they had all these like academics speaking about like some sort of scholarship on art, different artists and that sort of thing. And then they had these like artists doing like workshops and that sort of thing. And they asked me to do a workshop, and they like left off the doctor, and I was like, oh, hey, the academics have their doctor, like I'm a doctor too. And they're like, oh, we're not usually used to people having a doctorate in the arts. And I'm like, I don't have a doctorate in the arts. I'm a psychologist, but some people don't even know that. And then vice versa, of course, there's people that come to me or know me as an analyst that don't know the other aspect.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, bridging a lot of worlds, and yeah, it's kind of not quite box-inable. Yeah, which is wonderful. So you were talking a bit about some of your upcoming projects, and I wanted to be sure we can just share with the listeners what they can keep an eye out for. You have a lot in the pipeline. It's really, really cool and exciting. So anything more that you would like to say about the conference in May, or letting people know, is it three different books that are in the works?
Yeah, so let's see. I just had a book called Psychoanalysis and Violence come out in Routledge like last week. I don't even have it in my hands yet, but apparently it's out. I know other people that have gotten their copies. So that's something that I co-edited with this other analyst named Manya Steinkoler, and it's mostly Lacanian psychoanalysts talking about violence, mostly in our culture, but also more personally with like individual work with patients. Like there's one on like traumatized children, or children that have been abused, and then there's like one on school shootings and that epidemic, those sort of things, working with refugees that have come from war-torn places. So it kind of runs the gamut between like clinical work and the ideas from that, and like theory and the ideas about what's going on in American society that it's so violent at this point. So that's great. And then the next thing that I have is that I have an art exhibition at Gallery Granen in Sundsvall, Sweden, with my husband in January. So we'll be doing, those are like cut up collages and films that we've made, and we'll be doing a performance, like spoken word music and that sort of thing. I think the opening for that's January 12th. And then the next book that's coming out is called Rendering Unconscious. And that's on Trapart, which is a publishing company here in Stockholm. And that's a book where I collected writings from different psychoanalysts and psychologists that I know. and then also from poets and artists. So it's this kind of mix of, I was thinking of it as like different ways of managing in the world. We started collecting papers for it 2017, so it was like really hectic in America, and I've been kind of collecting papers for it for about a year. And so it's different ways that people have kind of related to the world we live in and the way they've written about it through theory. There's a few like pieces that are more creative, sort of fiction pieces by analysts, and then poetry. And then I'm handing in my book on Scansion, Psychoanalysis and Art to Routledge in May. And then there's a conference, and so that'll probably be at the end of 2019. And then there's a conference here in Stockholm that I'm going to be presenting that work at May 2nd through 4th through SIP, which is the International Society for Philosophy and Psychoanalysis, which is a really great group that they're international, so they don't have like one location. They have their yearly conference somewhere different every year. So like last year was in Paris, before that was in Brazil, now it's in Stockholm. They had their conference in New York in 2016. It was actually the exact weekend of the election. And we had this psychoanalytic philosophy conference like Thursday, Friday, Saturday that week. And so we were all like trying to talk about philosophy and psychoanalysis.
Good raw material there.
Getting a little depressed, and then going out to lunch and everyone's protesting, and then going back in. So that was interesting. So it'll be fun to meet up with that group again in Stockholm. And then I'm collecting papers for a book on Ingmar Bergman. So it's like psychoanalyst writing about Ingmar Bergman. Since I moved to Sweden, it feels apropos to write about Bergman. So the deadline for that's like in January. So that should be out also on Trapart sometime next year. And then, the conference, 100 Years of Esoteric Modernism and Psychoanalysis, is actually at Ezra Pound's castle, Brunenburg Castle, in northern Italy. So that should be fun. And the deadline for submissions for that is the end of this year. So hopefully we'll know in January who all the speakers are going to be, what the lineup's going to be. But I'm really looking forward to that, because the last one I had along those lines was in 2016 in London, and it was so fun and such a huge success. And everybody, my idea was I wanted to get people from like all these kind of worlds, like artists and like occult practitioners. Like we had a Santeria priest and a Kimbanda Tata and a voodoo priest talking to an Irish Lacanian psychoanalyst and British artist, sculptor, and like wanted everybody kind of to mix and mingle and put their ideas together. And everybody really got along and was working with each other's ideas, and people had different projects together afterwards, like birthed other books and that sort of thing, which was great for me because then I just had like more things to read and look at. And so I can't wait to do that again. And
that was the psychoanalysis, art, and the occult conference, right?
Yeah, that was in 2016.
There's remnants of that online, right? You can, I think there's maybe some YouTube, some talks that are up, and I know you did an interview with Gordon White on that is available.
We're in Soup, yeah.
Where you and Carl were both on there. So there's I'll try to link some of those in our show notes so people, if since they can't attend conferences, we can't quite slice up time that well yet.
Yeah.
But I guess sort of we can, because they can still listen to some of the talks. So.
That's true. We have YouTube. And I've made a few of them my podcast episodes. And there's also a book that Trapart published of collected papers from the conference. So if anyone wants to read them, they're collected into a book. I can send you one.
That'd be amazing. What's the title of it?
It's called the Fenris Wolf. Number 9. So Carl puts out a Fenris Wolf. Like it's supposed to be annual, but it's maybe every year and a half. And so the one from our conference, we put out as a collective anthology from the conference for that year's Fenris Wolf.
Yeah, that's awesome. I bet a lot of people who don't know about that would be interested in knowing that that's available. So we'll definitely link that as well. And you have a podcast yourself too, which shares the title of Rendering Unconscious with the other project you were talking about. And yeah, anything you want to share about that?
Yeah, I started that last January as kind of a complement to the book while I was putting the book together. And I basically interview different people like creative arts therapists, psychoanalysts, writers, artists. And I put some talks from the Psychoanalysis, Art, and Occult conference. And then I plan to just record future conferences that I do so that I can put different talks on the podcast for people that aren't able to go.
Very cool. And so we'll link all of these in the notes and give people all the resources they need to discover more about your work. And then just in case anyone doesn't venture to that realm of the show notes, can you just let people know where they can find your work online and learn more?
Sure. I mean, the best way to keep in touch is our Patreon, because we've gotten so overwhelmed with like social media and like maxed out on friends and this sort of thing that we found that we were like missing what our actual friends are doing and that sort of thing. So we made a Patreon where we like more actually talk and like write about what we're doing and what's coming up. Like Carl has an album with Genesis coming out next month. And so like he's been posting like tracks from the album and stuff like that. Or when I do cut up poems in the morning and record them, I'll just put them raw kind of on Patreon. So we've been using that mostly for our social media. And even like the lowest limit, like $1, $2, still gets used a lot because most of it we post just for everybody. And then, yeah, there's my website, drvanessasinclair.net. That's probably the easiest way because everything's linked from there. The podcast is linked from there, and like my art with Katelan Foisy is Chaos of the Third Mind, but you can find a link there, and all the books that I've ever done, there's links for them there. So that's probably the best kind of general hub.
Perfect. Well, Dr. Sinclair, thank you so much. This has been such a delight, and I feel like we've just explored some really rich terrain. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Great. Thanks for having me.